Was adjusting my tie in the church parking lot when my daughter-in-law Jessica walked over to my car, her wedding dress rustling against the gravel. The church bells had just finished their noon chime, and the world felt suspended in that perfect wedding day silence. 20 minutes before her marriage to my son Daniel was supposed to begin, and she had something urgent to tell me. "Mr. Robert," she said, her voice cutting through the stillness like ice. Her eyes were cold, calculated. "We've had to make some last-minute seating adjustments. We need you to sit in the back during the ceremony." The church I'd been attending for 37 years suddenly felt foreign. My hands trembled against the car door. "Family seating in the front is reserved for people who are actually contributing to our future together," she continued, each word chosen to inflict maximum damage. "It's nothing personal, Robert. Some people just don't fit in the front row." The same church where I'd married my late wife Helen, where we'd baptized Daniel, where Helen's funeral had been held just 18 months earlier. Jessica wanted me to sit in the back like a stranger at my own son's wedding. In that moment, I heard Helen's voice as clearly as if she were standing beside me. "Robert, if anyone ever tries to make our boy choose money over family, promise me you'll fight for him. Promise me you won't let them win." "Sit in the back," I repeated quietly, my throat tight with something between grief and rage. "You're not needed today, Robert. This day is about us, not you," Jessica said, adjusting the veil that Helen's wedding dress fund had purchased. Her designer dress probably cost more than most people's cars, a stark contrast to my simple gray suit. I could see Daniel through the church's stained glass windows, pacing nervously. When he caught sight of us, his face went pale. He started toward the door, then stopped, his shoulders sagging. My son, trapped between his father and his bride 30 minutes before his wedding. I understood perfectly what Jessica was really saying. What she didn't know was what I'd discovered about her fresh start and those new priorities, or what I'd been planning while they thought I was just a grieving widower. Helen's wedding dress fund. The small pearl earrings she'd saved for 18 months to buy as something special for Daniel's bride. The handwritten note she'd left for Jessica, with love and hopes for a lifetime of happiness. Jessica was wearing Helen's pearls while banishing Helen's husband to the back of the church. She thought she'd buried my dignity that morning. She had no idea she'd just awakened something far more dangerous. The truth. It had really started 3 months earlier, when Jessica began suggesting that Daniel needed to establish boundaries with his father. 3 months before the wedding, Jessica had started bringing her mother Patricia to our weekly family dinners with important conversations about Daniel's future. That evening, I remember Patricia's fork clicking against her plate as she cut into Helen's pot roast. The dining room felt charged with tension I couldn't name. "Daniel's father has some very traditional ideas about marriage and money management," Jessica explained, her voice carrying across the table. Daniel stared at his plate, sawing mechanically through his meat. "He keeps offering unsolicited advice about our financial decisions. It's creating unnecessary stress." I looked up from my plate. None of that was accurate. I had offered to help with wedding expenses after Daniel mentioned they were struggling. "Mr. Robert, young couples need space to make their own mistakes," Patricia said, dabbing her mouth with Helen's good napkins. "Sometimes older family members don't realize when their involvement becomes overwhelming." The way she said older family members felt like a blade wrapped in silk. I watched Daniel's shoulders tense, saw Jessica squeeze his hand, a gesture that looked supportive but felt possessive. Later, washing dishes while their voices drifted from the living room, I realized what was happening. They weren't managing family dynamics. They were systematically isolating Daniel from anyone who might question Jessica's decisions. Most people would have walked away at this point, but something in me refused to stay silent. I didn't know it yet, but that dinner was the first time they tried to push me out of my own family. What Jessica didn't realize was that her future father-in-law wasn't just Robert, retired insurance supervisor who'd spent 34 years processing claims. I'd always been careful with money, always noticed financial patterns, always understood when people were spending beyond their means. The conversation that changed everything happened 6 weeks before the wedding when I stopped by Daniel's apartment to drop off some of Helen's jewelry. Instead, I found the front door unlocked and voices coming from inside. I stepped into the entryway and froze. Jessica and Patricia were at the coffee table, surrounded by credit card statements, loan documents, and wedding expense calculations. Papers spread everywhere. The total wedding cost is approaching $85,000, Jessica was saying, her finger tracing down a calculator display. Daniel's father hasn't offered nearly enough to cover what we actually need. I stayed in the shadows, my hand gripping Helen's jewelry box until my knuckles went white. His house alone is our safety net, Jessica continued, lifting a property appraisal I'd never seen. Have you considered the inheritance timeline? He's already 73, owns that house outright, plus there are retirement accounts. He won't say no. You know how guilty widowers are. Patricia nodded, sorting through financial documents. Daniel mentioned his father. Feels responsible for family happiness since Helen died. My chest felt tight, like the air had been sucked out of the room. Daniel's too sentimental about his father, Jessica said, matter-of-fact, calculating. But once we're married, I can help him understand that family loyalty shouldn't prevent us from securing our financial future. This wasn't wedding planning. This was estate planning. They were calculating my net worth and projecting timelines for accessing assets they expected to inherit. They weren't planning a wedding. They were planning my disappearance from their financial equation. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table and spread out every document I'd found in Daniel's apartment. The overhead light cast harsh shadows across papers that would destroy any remaining illusion about Jessica's intentions. Each document I read felt like another small funeral for the life Daniel and I had built as father and son. Property transfer forms with my signature forged, power of attorney paperwork with predetermined conclusions, credit card debt totaling $67,000 between Jessica and Patricia. Robert's house appraisal indicates $420,000 equity, Patricia had noted. Combined with retirement accounts and life insurance, total estate value approaches $650,000. Jessica had written, elderly widowers often make poor financial decisions due to grief. Family oversight prevents impulsive spending while ensuring assets remain available for next-generation needs. They'd been researching estate planning strategies that would give married children legal authority over elderly parents' financial decisions. I adjusted my reading glasses and looked more closely at one particular document, a mortgage pre-approval form listing both Jessica and Daniel's names for a house purchase using my property as unauthorized collateral. By the time I finished reading, I realized Jessica wasn't marrying my son. She was marrying my signature. What truly revealed their timeline was a calendar notation I found. Wedding gifts, establish financial expectations. Jessica made her fatal mistake when she assumed I would simply accept her seating arrangement without investigating the financial motives behind her sudden hostility. Instead, I'd spent 6 weeks documenting their spending patterns. Robert isn't just going to hand over money because they demand it, I'd told my longtime attorney James. But Jessica doesn't need to know I'm paying attention to their credit reports. What Jessica didn't know was that I'd spent 34 years in insurance fraud investigation, which meant I understood financial manipulation better than she realized. They thought they were dealing with a confused old man. They forgot I'd spent 40 years solving problems they couldn't even spell. The lawyer looked at me and said quietly, "Robert, this isn't just carelessness. This is fraud, and you are the target." My own son's wedding had become the weapon pointed at my life. The proof stacked up faster than I could process it. Jessica had created financial obligations that required my money to avoid bankruptcy, but she'd made critical errors that any experienced investigator would identify. James confirmed that the house collateral claims violated multiple banking regulations, using someone else's property as security without authorization. Jessica had attempted inheritance fraud against someone whose career had been devoted to identifying exactly these financial schemes. Anyone who's ever been underestimated because of their age knows exactly why I kept fighting. I knew Jessica's scheme was finished when James contacted the district attorney's financial crimes division. The investigation expanded rapidly. "Robert, we've identified a comprehensive financial conspiracy," Detective Michael explained. "Fraudulent property transfer, forged documents, systematic inheritance manipulation." I kept asking myself, when did my son's fiancée start seeing me as a financial opportunity instead of a family member? Jessica had collaborated with Patricia to create fraudulent documentation targeting my relationship with Daniel. Detective Michael said they'd discovered similar schemes involving other elderly family members. I spread evidence across James's desk, Correspondence with financial advisors, inheritance calculations, fraudulent loan documents listing my property as collateral. Wedding expenses represent debt shifting to elderly family members, James noted, creating obligations beyond their means, then demanding reimbursement. Jessica didn't understand that manipulating inheritance requires legal expertise she didn't possess. What truly sealed her fate was discovering she'd already spent the money they expected me to provide, creating a debt crisis that would explode during their honeymoon. That week, I observed Jessica's confidence deteriorating as wedding expenses created financial pressure they couldn't manage. Vendors demanded payment. Credit card companies sent overdue notices. "Dad, there seemed to be some administrative issues with wedding financing," Daniel mentioned during a phone call. "Nothing serious, just coordination problems between vendors." "What kind of problems?" I asked, knowing exactly what crisis was developing. "Jessica says vendors are being unreasonable about timing," Daniel replied, his voice carrying new tension. "She thinks family members might need to help with cash flow. And if you think the paperwork was bad, what happened next would have made anyone question their own family." When venues demanded immediate payment, Jessica's explanations became defensive. When caterers threatened cancellation, Patricia suggested they might need immediate family financial assistance. "If Robert doesn't provide substantial help immediately, we're looking at bankruptcy before the honeymoon," I overheard Patricia complaining to Jessica during rehearsal. Jessica was learning that financial fraud creates consequences that investigators can follow to criminal charges. What confirmed her desperation was when she decided to humiliate me publicly at the wedding, hoping to pressure me into financial compliance. The night before the wedding, I sat in my study reviewing the comprehensive evidence file that would expose Jessica's financial fraud and protect Daniel from the debt crisis she'd created. I pulled out an old photo album, Helen on our wedding day, radiant in her simple dress. "I hope someday we'll see our daughter-in-law walking down this same aisle," she'd whispered. "Someone who'll love our family as much as we love each other." The evidence revealed calculated financial exploitation. Jessica had been planning to access my assets while creating debt obligations that would force my participation in their irresponsibility. Jessica's scheme represents systematic inheritance fraud, Detective Michael had explained. Fraudulent loan applications, unauthorized property claims, elder financial manipulation. Some insurance investigators spend their careers understanding exactly how inheritance fraud works and how to protect families from people who exploit trust for financial gain. Tomorrow, Jessica would walk down the aisle thinking she was marrying into money. She didn't know she was walking straight into an investigation. The confrontation came during the wedding reception when Jessica approached me with an envelope she expected me to fill with the substantial check they'd been counting on to cover their debt crisis. "Mr. Robert, Daniel and I are so grateful you could celebrate with us today," Jessica began, her voice carrying new authority as Daniel's wife. "We hope you understand why we needed to establish some boundaries." She placed the envelope on my table with a confident smile, obviously expecting the large financial contribution they'd planned their budget around. "The wedding expenses ended up being higher than projected," Daniel added, settling beside me with obvious discomfort. His bow tie was askew. "Jessica calculated that family contributions would help us start our marriage without financial stress." I looked at them calmly from my seat at the back table, the same seat I'd chosen deliberately after discovering their scheme. "Before I give you anything," I said quietly, "there's something important you should know about your wife's financial planning." I reached into my jacket and pulled out the legal documents James had prepared. The envelope slipped from Jessica's trembling fingers as I placed the papers on the table. The court order, freezing their credit accounts pending fraud investigation. The criminal charges filed against Jessica and Patricia for inheritance fraud. The bank notifications voiding loan applications that used my property as unauthorized collateral. "Jessica," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "you forgot that your father-in-law spent 34 years investigating financial crimes." Her face went completely white as she read the papers. At the neighboring table, an elderly woman whispered, "Oh my God," to her companion. "Dad, is this true?" Daniel's voice cracked as he picked up one of the documents. "Jessica, tell me this isn't real. The wedding expenses you couldn't afford create debts you can't pay," I continued. "The inheritance money you expected was never yours to spend." Patricia tried to gather the documents, but her hands were shaking too badly. Detective Michael was already approaching our table, his badge visible beneath his dress jacket. What finally ended their scheme was the moment they realized the wedding gift they had demanded was actually the evidence that would destroy their marriage financially. Justice came quietly when the district attorney filed comprehensive charges against Jessica and Patricia 6 weeks after the wedding. Both faced multiple felony counts related to inheritance fraud and elder financial abuse. The defendants systematically targeted elderly family members through wedding expenses, the prosecutor announced. They faced 12 to 18 years in state prison. Patricia's credentials were fraudulent. Jessica's credit was destroyed. Daniel filed for annulment after discovering the deception. 3 months later, Daniel knocked on my front door on a quiet Sunday evening. We sat on Helen's porch swing. "Dad, thank you for saving me from that future," he said quietly. "I was so blind to what she was doing." "Your mother always said you had a good heart," I told him. "She also said that good hearts sometimes need protecting." I wish Helen had lived to see him choose character over comfort. Sometimes the quietest justice comes from simply remembering who you are when others choose to forget. Jessica calculated that her elderly father-in-law would be easy prey for inheritance fraud disguised as wedding expenses, but she'd forgotten the most important detail about her target. When Jessica told me to sit in the back at their wedding, she thought she was establishing financial dominance over a confused old man. She didn't know I understood inheritance fraud better than she understood debt management. My wedding gift wasn't what she expected. My wedding gift was justice served through proper legal channels, systematic investigation, and complete financial protection for my son. The marriage lasted 6 weeks. The criminal charges will follow her for 18 years. And every morning I wake up in the house Helen and I paid for together, grateful that some relationships can be saved from people who mistake family love for financial opportunity. Justice stays quiet until it needs to speak. Then it speaks loud enough for everyone to hear.